Well, welcome back to our study of Paul and the writings of Paul. And for us, I think tonight is an interesting night because ever since I arrived here over 3 years ago, people have wanted to have a class about homosexuality in the Bible. And in the New Testament context, there's no way to do that any better than to do it while considering the work of Paul. And it does require that we go back and look at language and at culture and try to place what Paul has said in its historic context so that we can get an idea of what it meant to the people who originally heard it and his perspective on why these were such important topics for him. So we're going to do that tonight, and we're going to be using primarily the works of Sarah Ruden, again, in her book, Paul Among the People. And we're going to use some, we're going to use some work from Reverend Dr. Mona West, who is our newest elder in MCC. And we're going to use part of a course that I wrote during my work at Episcopal Divinity School and while I was helping with the MCC project in Jacksonville, Florida. So a lot of resources, a lot of quotes, several pictures, and again, for those of you in the room and for those who might watch it later, some of the pictures are pretty graphic, but it just has to be. We can't deal with this subject and with our heads buried in the sand, so beware. So let's dive in. And I've already showed you these sources. Again, this is the Ruden book, which I use extensively and recommend if you're looking for one to purchase. If you're interested in Mona West's article, I have the one that I used and would be happy to email you a copy of that. And then mine is really in a Bible study format that's meant for several weeks that we could do at a later time, but it won't really mean much to you if I send it to you because it's set up for a group discussion. You're welcome to see it if you'd like to. So, here we go. First, to start with a quote from Sarah Ruden, who says, quote, Paul's longest passage on homosexuality, Romans 1:24-27, is the single most fiercely debated piece of Paul's writing in Scripture. This passage is obviously important because it's placed as it is amongst almost at the beginning of what many scholars consider Paul's last and climactic letter, the one to the Romans, and forming as it does the heart of his most savage indictment of polytheism. And here Paul pronounces on the most divisive issue in Christianity today, because we know a few things. We know that preaching against the queers fills up seats in the church, and we know that preaching and advertising against gay people fills up the bank accounts. And so it is one of the most popular issues. It also seems to get votes from people who don't understand. Yes?
Jim, and since I've moved into the community, I've gotten 4 phone calls, robocalls, trying to get me to give money, and there's been a recording of preaching against the gay community. I don't know if you all got it.
I haven't received them myself. We're talking about robocalls from people fundraising on the basis of anti-gay stuff, and I haven't gotten them. But I have, for example, one of my favorite stories about my involvement with the Boy Scouts. When I was a director at a psychiatric hospital in Tampa, I actually brought the Boy Scouts on campus because I thought it would be a good activity for our little boys. And a couple years into it, I got a letter from the Boy Scouts of America asking me to write a letter to, it's not Bank of America, but it's one of the big old banks in the U.S., because they had decided to defund the Boy Scouts because of their anti-homosexual stance. And I very quickly called them up and invited them to move their troop off of our campus. Sometimes they just contact the wrong people. So I want to start out by reading, and you'll notice my familiar red readers, please. I want us to read this brief text It's not very long, really. Romans 1, 24 to 27, and just see what it says. So who would like to start our reading? Mike?
Romans 1, 24 through 27. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men gave up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error.
Yeah. Take a deep breath, now as you've heard that, and let's see how we can unpack it together. So we have to start out about how we're going to interpret the Bible. And next week, just for a little foreshadowing, we're really going to do that chapter from Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan about how to read or interpret a Pauline letter. We're not quite there yet, but I wanted to just start with this tonight. Many of the ways that people want to interpret Scripture are abusive, not only of the people that they want to use them against, but also against abusive of the text that they're actually trying to interpret. They interpret these texts in isolation from others that are related to them. We call that proof texting. So we're going to take one line out of a passage that belongs together and use, don't do this one behavior and totally ignore the rest of that. We see that a lot in the Old Testament writings and holiness codes and Levitical codes and that sort of thing. It is also true that not all parts of the Bible are of equal rank. And before you accuse me of heresy or something, just know that the Bible even says that about itself, that some parts are more important than others. So one example that's familiar to us is the way the Westboro Baptist Church and that minister uses this text in Romans to justify his, quote, God hates fags position. And the difference here is that he completely misses the command that says to love one another, which is set down in Jewish scripture and expanded upon by Paul over and over again throughout the writings of Paul. He takes this one little piece and decides that not only does God hate fags, but God hates soldiers who protect the freedoms of fags, and God hates the president or anybody else that is pro-equality and justice for gay folks. And we know that distorting the Bible's historical context is somewhat less flamboyant than that, but in the long run, it can be far more damaging. In other words, when a modern-day preacher picks up one little phrase or one little sentence out of context, it can be very media producing. Every time he shows up at one of those funerals, the media is there. When our own local radical right-wing extremist acts out, as he has been again lately, the media shows up. But it's just as damaging, and even more so, for us to take, or for biblical interpreters to take information out of its social and historic context and what it meant to the original writers and readers and hearers of that word, and bring it forward 2,000 or more years and say that it means something similar in a different, completely different context. So both are dangerous, and perhaps the second one is even more damaged than the first. So I want to take you through some other passages written by Paul so we get the full perspective, and they're mostly just one slide each, so let's just take turns. I'll kick us off, and then we'll go from one to the other. So this one is from 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 10. So do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. Somebody for this one?
The law is laid down not for the innocent, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the godless and sinful, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their father or mother, for murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to the sound teaching that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God.
And that's 1 Timothy, Paul's letter to Timothy, to remind you. So, there's some word studies that we have to pay attention to, and these are based on the work of Mona West, who I told you about in the beginning. So, first of all, translation. If we compare these verses in several different translations of the Bible, we see that there is some confusion, which may be an understatement, about how to translate two key Greek words in Paul's list of vices. The word, now you always remember that these are with my southern accent, right? The word arsenkoitai is translated homosexuals, sodomites, child molesters, and perverts, depending on where you look. So several different translations of the same word. The word malakoi is translated catamites, the effeminate, and boy prostitutes. Three different translations for the same word. So malakoi is a common Greek term that means soft. It can refer to clothing, maybe, I kind of like these soft cotton shirts and things. It can refer to moral matters and meanings of things, and the negative implication is undisciplined or out of control. Arsenokoitai is a rare word that is made up of arseno, which means man, and koitai, which means bed, lying, more like bedded, lying, or having sex with. And when you put the two together, arsenokoitai means when the two people are having sex and one of them is a male prostitute. Okay? So several meanings. Now, when the words are placed in the context of Greek culture, which is mostly where Paul was writing from, they also have very specific meanings. The Mediterranean world had a definition of sexuality that was based on dominance and submission and unequal status. One had to be dominant all the time, one had to be submissive all the time, and they could not be equals. They had to be one more powerful than the other. Greek culture fine-tuned that definition with regard to status. In other words, I had to be the master, and if I were the dominant one, and the less dominant one had to be the slave, or the less respected person in culture. So proper or natural sexual relations occurred between people who were unequal. And that is to say that if the pair were equals, which the scripture refers to, that was part of what made it improper. Two equal partners could not legitimately have sex together. There's also this practice in ancient Greek culture called pederasty, in which a younger man was socialized and educated and prepared through a close relationship with an older man. We see some images of this in like temple worship, where a priest would have a young boy that he was training up in the temple. And these older men were the boys, and literally boys, somewhere between probably 10 and 13 years old, patrons, and often their lovers. And in some way, by just plain societal standards, it did meet the requirement of unequal. One was dominant, one was older, one had more power, one was submissive, younger, no power, no position in society. And this is just a piece of artwork that shows an image of this pederastic relationship with an older, or he's got the olive branch in his hair and is mature, holding this boy who was both his trainee and his toy, to put it bluntly. So these relationships were seen as key in raising the next generation of city leaders, and there were strict rules about how long the relationship could last and the roles of family within these relationships. So you might expect that there was some abuse happening in the relationship with the young boys as they were being exploited and kept by the patron, and here's the key where it gets out of sync, well after those boys had become adults. Why? Because now they were equals, and equals were not allowed to have legitimate sex together. As long as one was an adult and one was a boy, on some level, okay, but once they become equal, and especially men, forget about it. It's completely inappropriate. Now, this would mean that two equals were having sex, which would violate the sexual code, which we've just talked about, which was only allowable for unequals. But these abusive relationships are what Paul is talking about, not mutually loving and caring relationships between people of approximately the same developmental stage, in other words, adult, and same gender. And unfortunately, it gets worse than this. I'm breaking it to you gently so far. So, looking at Romans 1, it's also important for us to read these verses, and all the verses for that matter, within their larger context. And once again, proof texting doesn't work. Let me just say to you, from my perspective as one who studies the Bible, proof texting never works. You have to take even to say Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible. Well, what for? What made him weep? We just don't know. Proof texting does not work. And it's also important for us to know that at this point in Paul's ministry, he had not yet been to Rome, to the Roman church, when these verses were written. So Paul's purpose, if you look at all of his writing, appears to be to lay out a doctrine of grace, believe it or not, in all that we get clobbered over the head with in what we call clobber passages. The real intent of Paul is to preach and teach a doctrine of grace. For example, remember this verse, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and then there's a way out of that, a way for repentance and forgiveness in Romans 3. Also important is that the audience to which Paul both wrote and speak included Jewish people and Gentiles. And so we'll look at both sides of some of these issues. In chapter 1 of Romans, Paul tries to point out the behavior of the Gentiles that kept them from God. In chapter 2, he shifts from the Gentiles and does the same thing about the Jews. And so Paul's reference to, quote, natural and unnatural, which he seems to use as much for women as for men, because I have to tell you later on it gets down to basically the issue of penetration. But for right now, with natural and unnatural, he's talking about women as clearly as he is men. This has to be taken in the context of his own Mediterranean understanding of sexuality within that culture. And so let me go ahead and say, for the first time of many times tonight, Paul is not trying to teach about or against homosexuality as we know it. The behavior is translated incorrectly. As a matter of fact, we know that the term homosexual, as we hear it today, didn't even exist in Paul's time. This is a clinical term that came up in the practice of psychology many generations later. There was no word that was called homosexuality the way we know it in English at the time that Paul lived. So it just follows logically to say that Paul could not write about, Paul could not condemn something he'd never heard of. Okay? Now, Paul is trying to meet his audience on their own terms by using examples of some people who are not upholding the dominant, submissive requirement for sex. He's looking for an obvious opportunity, which everybody would have known about, that would give him a chance to talk to them about what? The saving grace of Jesus, because, as I said before, it is true that the primary purpose of the work of Paul was to present the saving grace of Jesus, not really to condemn anybody. And so we have this nice example of grace. I'm sorry? We're having a little technical difficulty. There it goes. All right. Thank you. I would have never known. Okay. So consider this. We know this about Paul, right? Another teaching mandated circumcision for all males. And we know Paul, even though he might have abandoned the practice, was obsessed with circumcision and how it happened and if it had been done or not. You know, we know some people like that, but we're not going to get there tonight. Judaism would not always hand down what Christianity would practice. In other words, not everything that even the early church would do in their worship and in their teaching and in their preaching came down from Judaism. Quite a bit of it was new, although quite a bit of it did come down from Judaism. Probably the thing that influenced Paul the strongest on this subject is what he witnessed as a young child. So, walking down the streets of the city, prostitution, remember we talked about already, was completely legal. There was no morality problem with it. There were prostitutes that you could go hire a prostitute, and that was one of the things that was so tricky about all those rules about adultery and who it applied to. So why mess up this woman and potentially her children, where a lot of times you could just find a woman who was willing to have sex, and sometimes you didn't even have to pay for it. And so he's talking about prostitutes, which would have included young boys his age, not only hanging out on the street waiting for a partner, and let me be clear, they were managed by pimps, just like prostitutes are now, but also in the brothels, you would see young boys standing in the windows in seductive poses, just like you might see a woman prostitute standing there too. Jim?
The temple prostitutes, could you say a word about that?
I'm going to.
Okay.
So let me get there.
All right.
That's it. Trust me, it's in here. Okay. So and remember, slavery is also legal and common and okay in society. So at any slave auction that little boy Paul might have attended, he might have watched boys his own age who would have been up for sale too. And those boys were often purchased by these pimps at very high prices. And with that high price came these awful jokes about the kinds of things that these boys were going to have to do to prove that they were worth it. And these were some very, very horrible experience that these children looked forward to with great dread, I'm sure. But Paul would have heard this too, and he would have heard the jokes. And so a pious Jewish family, such as the one that we believe Paul came from, would have done anything to keep their sons away from this behavior. They would have done anything to keep their sons from being lured into this by perceived leaders in the community. They would have done anything to keep their sons away from that sort of culture, and they certainly would have done almost anything to keep their sons from choosing to go out on their own and live as a prostitute and make their own money that way. However, the households of Paul's non-Jewish friends certainly would have owned these slaves, including sex slaves. So it's altogether believable that Paul would have witnessed so much of this with his own little boy eyes, and I'm just sure he was scared to death. Now, history and culture tells us that these household slaves were less respected as objects of physical pleasure than even the household toilet. It was less important to keep them clean. It was less important to keep them healthy. It was less important to keep them taken care of and in proper condition than it was even the toilet. They had no status whatsoever. The clear and only function or role for these slave boys was for anal sex with any and all free adults, implying men who could penetrate them. And so flagrant pedophiles probably also bothered Paul and his friends. And we know some ways that they would have done that. They might have offered to be the coach of their team or to offer some athletic training. Maybe we're going to go learn how to box and then we're going to get in the shower together. They would have offered money. Go do this one thing, or come do this one thing to me and I'll give you money, or I'll buy you ice cream, or I'll whatever, money. And also they would have offered these attractive young boys gifts. Do this and I'll buy you a Rolex. Do this and I'll buy you the latest Game Boy, or whatever else is on the market. I've lost track of all those video games. So trusted adults would have told him that any association with these people would not only permanently ruin his reputation, but would also lead to the permanent loss of his civil rights. We hear it again, just like we did last week, that these folks, these children, not only lose their position in the community, but they actually lose their citizenship. And for a boy not to be able to participate in the political process, not even to have a vote, not to have an opportunity to rise up in that structure, basically meant the end of his productive life and the end of any respect for him in the community. So it just follows logically that having witnessed all of this and having been warned about it and having probably been offered opportunities to participate in it, after Paul's conversion, he was going to go to almost any length to make sure that none of that ever happened in this Jesus-based society that Paul was helping to establish. So, in case you think that some of this is an exaggeration, I want to show you some supportive documents and pieces from real Roman and Greek culture at the time. So the Roman poet Martial uses the phrase, quote, to be cut into pieces, as the ordinary term for the passive partner in this kind of anal intercourse. So in other words, the bottom, okay? To be cut into pieces. The Greeks and Romans thought that the active partner in homosexual intercourse, now notice these words, used, humiliated, and physically and morally damaged the passive partner. We're talking about physical tearing of flesh, stuff you go to the emergency room for after it's happened to you. Heterosexual penetration could be harmless in the Christian community and in marriage, by the way, even if it too was brutal. But homosexual penetration in this context could be harmless nowhere. There were no gay households, there were no gay role models, there were no gay institutions, there was no such thing as gay culture. There was no place where two men could go, whether they were equal or unequal, really, where they would have a mutually safe environment to have sex with one another, because in this interpretation, that act is never safe. Somebody always gets brutalized. somebody always gets hurt. And so, once again, this is not what we know as a gay relationship. Again, homosexual was invented as a clinical term which came much later. Therefore, logically, Paul could not write about, Paul could not condemn something that he had never experienced. And we know that there are some variants in our world, but we don't support the brutalization of anybody either. We agree with Paul on that. Two consenting adults who are not permanently causing injury to each other may be okay. But when somebody gets brutalized and ends up in the emergency room, we agree with Paul about that. At least I do, I'll say that. Even if it's within their agreements. Sending people to the emergency room is not okay. So, one exception to the boy-slave rule was what the Romans called glabri, or smoothies. And this would be a Roman slave who stayed in sexual service to an adult man, and he would have to wear boys' clothes and have all his body hair plucked out, not shaved off, but plucked. Now, I'm not going to take my shirt off, but y'all know enough about me to know that there's quite a few hairs on this body. Imagine you pluck your eyebrows, or maybe y'all don't do that, I don't know. I sort of go across mine with a clipper, but pain. Having your, not electrolysis, not waxing, plucking these hairs out. And so Paul's contemporary Seneca writes that this is a pitiful form of oppression. In myth, Zeus raped the prince Ganymede, but compensated him with eternal youth and a job as the god's bartender. What kind of reward is that? And so a modern idea of what a glabry might look like. Smooth, young, I don't know about the cat on the head, but the boy's clothes that are like ripping off of him. And that person, as long as he was willing to endure that kind of painful treatment and minimization and brutality, could possibly stay in the relationship. There are literary references to, now I put gay men, because there's a lot of times that you're going to see use of the term homosexual, just because that's the common use. And let me just say now, when you see this from this point on in the lesson, let's just all understand that it's there because that's what the writers use. It is not our form of homosexual that we know today. It's that mistranslation form. And I'll remind you. So Juvenal was a Roman poet who wrote around the 2nd century and wrote this: "What can a rich man keep secret? Though the slaves are mum, his horses, dogs, and mules, his doors, his marble columns will speak. He can shut the windows, cover every trink with hanging, lock the doors, take the lamp away, send everybody out, let nobody sleep anywhere near him. Still, before dawn, by the 2nd cock crow, the barman down the road will know. The master will also hear the things his head cooks, his carvers, his confectioner make up. Who'd hesitate to invent a slanderous charge as a payback for the lash? At the crossroads, too, some drunk will run you down and swill the story into your cringing ear." So we know what that's referring to. There's another notion which involves what we call closeted, people who protest too much, homosexuals, but only in the passive domain. In other words, these are the penetrated again. They are pictured as a small gallery of burly, hairy, stony-faced perverts. Some of them, like certain effeminates, are like some effeminates shown in literature. Some of them seem to have been real people. They're some of the pictures that resemble folks in society. They're always seen as stern, old-fashioned moralists, or I call them closet cases, always ready to denounce others. In other words, I may be doing this in the closet, but don't you dare do it because it's wrong and evil, and you can't get away with this in public, even though I'm doing it in the bathroom stall. How could anybody, any man, feel safe in his reputation for proper masculinity? The preemptive verbal aggression really can be understood, because one of the fastest ways people thought, and obviously still do, that they could hold on to the closet door with both hands was to come out in public condemning the very behavior in which they are participating. Maybe even condemning those who share their own sexual orientation. We would expect them to try to cover it up. Now, for the active partner, there really was no justification, no comeback, no acceptable answer for his callous behavior. And at the same time, there really were no derogatory terms for him, no slanderous words used against him. He could positively strut around between his wives and his girlfriends and his female slaves and his prostitutes and his boys, because, this is a little scary, penetration signaled moral uprightness. If the man could be a man and penetrate his wife and penetrate his girlfriends and penetrate his slave women and penetrate the boys who he was responsible for training, he was morally upright because he was a man and he had virtue. And remember, virtue comes from a Latin root, virtus, which literally translates manliness. So when somebody tells you you're virtuous, just here, there's a little masculine undertone with that, although we don't recognize it today. So in fact, society actually pressured men to be brutal in their sexual activity with other men. In other words, if a man had a boy in this pederastic relationship, it was not okay to be gentle and kind about it. The societal expectations were that the man, the dominant penetrator, would brutalize that boy to show the difference in status and power, because equals can't do it. Pretty scary stuff. So, to keep it unmistakable that the man had no sympathy for passive homosexuals, men would go around bragging about what they had done to these boys, and I'm saying young boys. They talked about all the, I'm not going to go there, but all the brutality of it and all the gory details. And when you go out with the boys and pop a beer or whatever, all the gory details were exposed, and they actually built themselves up that way. Greek and Romans even held up the act of rape as a divinely sanctioned activity. The idol of sexual aggression, which we see up here in Roman culture or Greek culture, is Priapus. Now, here we go. Take a deep breath. Notice, he's in the image of a scarecrow. He has this ungodly, huge phallus. And so the idea is that Priapus would be the guardian of a man's garden or his property. And that he was the scarecrow image with the huge phallus, and his job was for any intruder that came into a man's property or garden, as we call it, Priapus would brutally rape that intruder with this monstrous phallus. It was lawful for him to police the gardens and use this sexual threat, and the predominant thought or aspect of this threat was that it was brutal, painful, and humiliating to anybody that came in to the owner's space, property, garden. So, is it any wonder that parents protected their young sons so doggedly from involvement in this? Predators usually turned those with no protection, young male slaves and prostitutes, into sexual slaves. So it's also no wonder to us that Paul wrote so strongly against that kind of behavior, which has very little to do with what we know in the year 2012 about homosexuality, gay, lesbian, bi, trans, same-gender loving relationships. As a matter of fact, I think it would be safe, and you tell me if I'm wrong, for us to agree now that we agree with Paul, that that kind of brutal, humiliating, painful, body-damaging behavior is perhaps an abomination. And it's not the same thing as what we know as homosexuality. So, Sarah Ruden again says, I picture Paul flushed and sweating in his rage as he writes that everyone is responsible for what pederasty has made of society. The leaders of the community, the leaders of the temple, the business people who ran these slave auctions, everybody in society was responsible because they had set this up as okay. They had endorsed the imbalance of power that leads to this brutalization of the helpless, especially those who, egging one another on in an insolent, boastful clique, damage others with active sodomy and then blame them for what happened. These acts are the very same things, no matter who is doing what to whom. Everybody's responsible. And the really saddest part of it is to look at the victim and say, well, it's your fault. If you hadn't dressed that way, I wouldn't have done it to you. If you hadn't been effeminate, I wouldn't have done it to you. If you hadn't agreed to be the passive one in the relationship, you wouldn't have gotten hurt. You're responsible for all of this. That's what Paul is condemning. Much different from what we know as homosexuality. Now, if we flip over to Galatians, we see a list of horrors which are also put together by Paul. Notice and think about what we've just been over. Wickedness, evil malice, covetousness, envy, deceit, craftiness, inventors of evil, gossips, remember that bar scene I just described, slanderers, insolent, haughty, boastful, heartless, ruthless, God-haters. We're going to talk about those a little bit. Inventors of evil. It didn't really look like God had created sodomy, but that humans had. As a matter of fact, we know that the whole term sodomy is a misnomer because it implies penetration, it implies sex. And the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible itself, tells us verbatim, you don't want to be guilty of the sin of Sodom, which was inhospitality. The sin of Sodom is the sin of inhospitality. It's not even a sexual sin to begin with. So God didn't create that. People did. In its Greco-Roman form, it was like the idolatry it is linked with in this passage, especially a worship of the self and its immediate desires with all of the stupidity and cruelty entailed in that. In other words, it's all about me. If I want this from this young, powerless person, then it's all about me. It's about what I want. Not even a person, just an object. That's what we call inventors of evil. Rebellious against parents. And so we know that this kind of rebellion was a parent's worst nightmare. It's kind of like the drug epidemic of their time. With all the children that I've worked for so many years, the last thing I want to hear, and I'm not even their parents, is that they've gotten off on drugs. So this was kind of like I certainly hate it when I hear that our young folks are homeless, because I know that that will lead to similar circumstances to what we're talking about. Apparently, the biggest threat for losing control of a son and seeing him completely lost to society and all his potential lost was for him to fall into this sort of environment, either voluntarily or by being lured into it by one of these adults. Gossips and slanderers, we already heard that victims suffered and perpetrators got immunity because they could sit around and gossip and talk about it, and the more brutal they said they were, the more they got lifted up, the more their status increased. And there's always the possibility of blackmail. You never really are safe in the closet because somebody's going to know. Your housekeeper's going to know, your kid's going to know, your partner's going to know. You're going to slip and say something. So gossip and slander both lifts us up and tears us down again. God haters. Now this is where we come in, Jim, to your point. Those who practiced homosexuality showed a hatred of God. Now again, that's this form of homosexuality, not our definition. Because if you do this in the temple as part of your worship, and you're brutalizing and damaging physically and emotionally another human being, and you're calling that part of your worship, then you are interpreted as a God hater. Now, on the other hand, the Greeks turned this around just a little different angle, because they viewed this behavior as behavior that was hated by God. The Roman view is that you are a God hater for doing it. The Greek view is that God hates you for doing it. And probably because of the overwhelming Greek influence on Paul, he would lean toward that latter view, that those who participate in this kind of behavior may hate God, but the truth is they are hated by God. Thus, Paul's vehemence in writing and teaching and lecturing against it. And then wickedness, which seems a little bit vague to us. We don't always talk about wickedness so much, although I could point a few examples of it out for you. A better translation for us might be the word injustice, because it really is about hurting people who don't have the power to fight back. Hurting people who, for whatever reason, have less status or less power, or worse yet, hurting people who trust us to take care of them. And so it's really this kind of behavior that we see God has such contempt for, and that we want to warn against. So try this on. This is my phrase to sort of bring this all together. The ungodly failure in their attempts to worship because of their extremely unjust behavior. That's what we're talking about. That's what Paul is writing about. And that is the big problem with the behavior, is that it's an ungodly failure in an attempt to worship because of the extremely unjust behavior used to do so. One way to summarize it. So I want to look at some conclusions that other people have come to, and some of our own, and then I want to make some of our conclusions together tonight. So first, the single most important concept that defined sexuality in the ancient Mediterranean world, whether we are talking about the kingdoms of Egypt or of Assyria, or whether we're talking about the later kingdoms of Greece and Rome, is that approved sexual acts never occurred between social equals. That's the problem. Sexuality, by definition, in ancient Mediterranean societies required the combination of dominance and submission, this crucial social and political root metaphor of dominance and submission as the definition of sexuality rested upon a physical basis that assumed every sex act required a perpetrator and someone who was perpetrated. There's no other form of sex. Needless to say, this definition of sexuality was entirely male. Not surprising in the heavily patriarchal societies of the Mediterranean. That quote is from Mary Tolbert, who's a professor of biblical studies at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California, which is one of the seminaries. If you can't go to Episcopal seminary, Episcopal Divinity School, you could consider that one. Mary Tolbert. I'm not sold out to one school by any means. Another conclusion, and this is from our own Mona West, in these societies, sexual acts between men did happen, but they happened in order to show dominance of one group of men or a man over another, especially in times of war. It was not uncommon for men who had conquered a foreign army to rape them in order to show that they were dominant and of a higher status. I will also add, because I know Mona would agree with this, they also rape them to show that they themselves, the penetrators, are of a higher order, but also brutally, in the most damaging possible ways, for nothing more than an act of humiliation. We beat them and we raped them brutally. And they'd talk about it. They'd gossip about it, talk about the details of the gory act and how they whimpered and cried and all else that happened. Not just penetration, but brutalization and humiliation. And there, of course, is Mona at the day of her installation as an elder. I see those looks. So, I have some of my own. I think I have 10 of these that I want to present to you, and then we'll take some time. And also, if you want to talk about these as we go, just raise your hand, and this would be a good time for us to start the discussion. Number 1, these are what I think are important for us to draw out of the lesson tonight. Paul had absolutely no concept, no idea of what our modern day same-gender loving relationships look like. He had never seen one. He'd never heard of one. They didn't exist in society, and therefore, number 2, Paul could not possibly write about what he had not experienced. Okay? Totally different, and he couldn't write about what he hadn't seen. What Paul is writing about specifically is horribly abusive sexual relationships. Imbalances of power, humiliation, physically damaging, completely abusive relationships. These relationships always involved significant imbalances. In some examples, adults with children, masters with slaves. We don't like that language, but that's what you have when you have somebody that goes to an open market and buys a slave specifically for sex. Mentor, mentee, always imbalanced, never equal. Number 5, often these physical relationships continued after the penetrated became an adult, therefore violating societal rules that equals were not to have sex with each other. But it's also important to note that the only way they could do that was through the further humiliation of the one being penetrated, the bottom. He had to wear boy clothes, whether they fit or not. He had to get rid of all body hair, plucking out one by one, very painful. And he had to become sort of a caricature, which is why I chose that kind of silly looking picture that I did a while back in order for that to continue. And he had to accept that he was always going to be the man out, the low man on the totem pole, the joke of society. This is very important, I think, to understanding why Paul was so powerful in his writing about this, because he sees this behavior through the eyes of a little boy, Paul, who both witnessed this kind of behavior in society and feared that somehow he was going to fall into it. I like what Mona says, or Mary Tolbert says, about this sweating, angry Paul that's writing about this stuff as he remembers these fear-producing things that he'd witnessed. Number 7, in Paul's view, this brutal, violent behavior, not what we know as same-gender loving relationships between equals, was a worship failure. It was God haters. It was hated by God because of the brutality and violence involved in it. That's what made it evil. Number 8, when we fully understand the languages and the culture of Paul's time, these readings can no longer force us into closets. When we really understand what Paul is writing about, when your Aunt Laura, as mine did to me, says, well, I don't have to condemn you because God already did it in the first chapter of Romans, end of quote, we can say back to her, wait a minute. God didn't talk about this. Paul didn't talk about this. Was Paul God? And this is different from what Paul is talking about. It also, understanding this, helps us avoid when somebody wants to call us a monster or an abomination or some other ugly name. Because if we really understand what it is Paul's writing about, then we don't participate in that behavior. We know there are some variants in society who would, but that's not us, I hope. It's not us. And so it can't be used to label us as God haters and monsters and evil doers and haters and all of this. And so to use them this way represents a significant misunderstanding of what the scripture is saying to God's people. It goes back to when I was using the illustration of Westboro Baptist Church, God hates fags. It's one thing to get out and be flamboyant and make big ugly signs that the media is going to put up, and they're so anti-God, and we know that. But it's another thing to ferociously use a misinterpretation of Scripture in its own historical and cultural context to perpetrate evil against any group of people in society. And I really do believe that all of these folks are smart enough to study. And that if they really want to go back the way we've done very quickly tonight at the languages and the history and culture, the truth of what Paul is saying is available to them. And until they get there, we do not have to be their victims. So, those are my conclusions. Jim, I see your hand.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of what we deal with in our culture is people repeating back what they learned from somebody else who may not have been a thorough scholar. And so a lot of times when I say our culture, I'm talking about the Western culture.
Yes.
And so where I'm going with this is that they don't really go and do the homework, as my professors used to call it. And I think in order to really be learned and to really know what you're talking about, you've got to do what we're doing here by studying this, or do the homework that you did prepare, so that we do understand culture, the culture on which it's based.
Yes, it reminds me, did you all see the guy the preacher, I think he was in North Carolina, that said that gay people should be put behind an electric fence? Did you see the woman that Anderson Cooper interviewed who tried to defend him? And she kept saying, well, that is what the Bible says. And I was like screaming at my computer screen, no, it's not. But you're right. This is what she's been fed her whole life. And with all due respect, I don't think this woman could probably read this book effectively. I mean, I'm not being ugly. I'm just talking about the reality of IQ levels. And when you don't know and you're not able to get to the truth, you just parrot what's been taught to you over and over again. But I was literally like holding on to I watched it for the first time in my office, and I'm holding on to the desk screaming, no, it's not what the Bible says. What else? What other things do you see? Nadine?
Well, two things, one comment and one question. One of them is I don't think we've transitioned very far from some of the attitudes of the master slave or the submissive,
Yes.
etc. Because when I look at some of the right-wing religion, the relationship between the man and the woman, we still have, the same. The man has to be the person.
Yes. Well, and you see it, in the public forum when our own Congress just literally robs women of the right to health care that they need. It's not a fallacy, this term war on women. And mostly those people are male, but even the women, this is the scary part, even the women voted against women's health care in Congress this year. And so how does that happen?
The other thing, I have a question now. Where did Mona West get her information that Paul came up with these ideas based on his childhood vision?
Because this behavior and this subset of society was so common. And history, secular history support it. We know that the prostitution was legal and that children were involved in the sex trade. And so as a normal kid growing up in that time, in that place, it would be, to deny it would be like saying that our kids today might never see a video game. It's just so prevalent in that time that he would, if he walked down the street, he would have seen it.
Another question.
Yes. Keep flowing.
What was with the slaves, the boys that were boys when they were boys, and then they continued this in adulthood? What would be their other option after they've been slaves? What could they do in their own life? Could they get away?
Well, if they completed their training, with whatever their master, their mentor was training them, maybe they could shift into a normal role. Because you see, this was an accepted thing in society. Just because you had been somebody's boy didn't mean you were labeled for the rest of your life. Almost everybody had.
Did the master get a new boy then?
Oh yeah, there is always a steady stream of boys, and to a point, until the master wasn't able to do it. But it follows that these guys, when they reached adulthood, would go on. They could get married, they could have their own families. But once they engaged in that adult, equal relationship, then they lost their rights and their status and all of that, and could never get it back again. Armando.
It's something that has always bothered me, and I think this is a time to get out of it. Why homosexuality is so much hate in the whole world. It's Mayas, Incas, all the other Central and South America, they hate homosexuality. It was condemned with death, and a very awful death. And we have the same issues in Africa. We just talked of the Western world, Hebrew and Christian tradition. What about the others?
Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation. I don't know the official answer to that, but I'll just tell you some possibilities. There are people who have written about, that if wasting seed, in other words, you weren't producing children to help with labor, and especially little boys to help with war, and so it was a waste. It's been about the masculine, clearly defined, which I think are impossible to clearly define, what means masculine, what means feminine, and if you variate from that at all, you're an abomination, you need to be killed. The Indians, we know, had honored roles for homosexual people. They were spiritual gurus, spiritual mentors, teachers. So you're right that we have been condemned.
A type of relation which they hate and they use at the same time. Because the perfect priest was the gay one.
Yes.
Because he was had communication with both worlds.
Right. Yes.
And so on, it happens. And at the same time, they hate homosexuality.
Right. Well, it's like when I was still playing, literally, in the Baptist church as a church musician, this was the same time that all of this hardcore anti-gay stuff was going on, beginning to start. And one of my favorite things to say is if you take all the gay people off the pianos and organs and out of the choir on Sunday, there'll be no music in church. And they love us for that. And they know. They really do know. I mean, trust me, they knew about me all those years, whether they would put words to it or not. But they're not willing to risk that. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship. And the world, I mean, there's been no secret. I mean, you look back and who have the artists been and not real discreet all the time? Who have the designer, clothing designers and sculptors and musicians, and they love what we do as long as we don't make them see it.
What happened in New York between the years of 79 to 87 or about 10 years?
Yeah.
The whole culture of the city went down.
Yes.
There was no creative. Galleries were empty.
Right. And the same thing happened to MCC. Happened to our church, because during those years we lost literally the group of pastors who would have been my immediate elders don't exist because they died.
I asked that once, why does the church only have women in the director?
Yeah.
And she looks at me and says, we do not men, we are very few men.
Right.
Because they have all that.
And that's, it's true. It happened all over the place. And but I really believe that the hatred comes from a misinterpretation of religious texts, whether it's Christian or some more ancient form. Especially we see in this that the very readings that are used by our most vehement oppressors don't apply at all. It's a misinterpretation. And yet we know that it builds attendance and it builds fundraising and it gets votes because it supports the familiar, the stuff that I think it was Jim or somebody said, the stuff that people have been fed and just never know any better. And people do rally against something they can hate. Even for our community, one of the best things that can draw us together is a good crisis.
It happens right now here in Gainesville. I was telling Elaine that one of my neighbors called the police about two guys that were kissing.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't believe it. I don't know what was the answer of the police. I know they left without them.
Yeah, an ordinance as far as I know about that.
Yeah. Medina?
I think you find it's the same story of somebody. Some people have to have somebody to hate.
Right.
And the people. It seems to me that there's a clump. The people that hate the homosexuals also hate a black president. Also hate gun laws, and also it just goes right on down the line.
Yeah. And despite, we would like to consider ourselves mainstream, but even if you take the highest estimate, we're only 10% or 5% or maybe 2.5%, but we are different from, in that regard, just that one thing, different from the majority of people still, and we know that human beings are very uncomfortable with anything that's different. And I will also say, I think some of our own stereotypes that we've perpetrated contribute to it. You know, we've had, with all due respect for all of my queer sisters and brothers, we've had a tendency to allow ourselves to put our least desirable attributes on the front page. And I think that's something that we do, almost like internalized homophobia. Jim?
There's a network, I don't know what it's called, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate to say the name anyway, but there's a network, and occasionally I'll flip to it. I have the cable. And I hope to find something that's positive on there. And that's exactly where I was thinking, is I flip to it sometimes and I would fall, because I'm thinking, those aren't the people I know. Like I told my mother, I said, Mom, my friends in the community, you wouldn't find any of them to be disrespectful. And she knows that. And so when I flip to that network, I wish that they would put, something a little more, but it doesn't sell.
Right. That would be that network that sounds like a little animal, I'm sure. Elaine.
A little bit more about
Women. Women had no status.
Yeah, I mean, even when the sentence, I keep reading, even the women,
Yeah.
They at least get mentioned. But,
Yeah, and women, how dare a woman do something for her own pleasure? Her job was to be the object of domination or penetration for the man. Seeking her own pleasure could have been seen as unnatural, immoral, unnatural. A woman was the perfect sexual partner for a man because she had no rights, she had no status, and it was her role, and by all means didn't have a penis, and so was there for the pleasure of the man. And so seeking out your own pleasure, if two women get together, they're of the same status. Because they're both, I don't think this way, but I'm just telling you the way it was. They're both no status. So they're equals again. And then it becomes unnatural and outside the rules of society too. Mike.
Just to add to what Medine was saying, as far as hate goes, I think we're the last group that society can hate until another group comes along that they can move their focus on. So until we can be replaced by another group, we're going to be the blunt of everyone's hate. Because once we're accepted, then everyone in the world is accepted.
You know who I think it runs a close second behind us these days? I agree with you, by the way. But the ones who are running up very close behind us are poor people. This society hates poor people. Poor and gay, you're in trouble. But that's the group that we're seeing more and more hateful acts toward, is the poor.
Gay, foreign, old.
Yeah.
Because I think they hate old people too.
No. All of this war on healthcare and stuff.
I was making a list and I classified in 5 points.
A lot of this is not wanting people to have what we have. Poor people are in a very precarious spot. Old people, gay people, foreigners. But you're right. There's been women's rights. There's been rights based on ethnicity, African American, people of color, and Coretta Scott King after Dr. King died, said if he were alive today, she believed this would be his battle, the battle for equality and justice for gay folks. Whether it would have been or not, I don't know, but a wife usually knows her husband pretty well by the time they'd been married as long as they had.
Didn't she change her story though? Wasn't it different about 1990 and then she changed it at about 93?
I was not familiar with what she was doing in the 1990s, but by the time I got involved in the public policy process and was around her a couple of times, she was pretty rock solid on it and wrote about it. And her children, Bernice King particularly, their daughter vehemently disagreed with her.
Well, maybe that was it. We General Conference was in Atlanta, and I can't remember the year, whether it was 95 or 96, somewhere in there. 95. Was it? And they were, we had a rally with them. That was interesting.
His daughter, for the first time, I want to say last year, but let me just say within the last 12 months, has made a gay-friendly statement. But up until that point, she's been vehemently homophobic.
She might have been the one, not
Yeah, Bernice King.
Well, Ms. King had several staff members that were gay men.
Yes.
Very devoted. And we can all look at Jim and Tammy Faye and see that once Jim was out of the picture, Tammy Faye became very accepting, very active. And we would have never expected that when they had to be jailed. Although half of the staff that I knew, some of them working.
And now their son is the thing he gets beat up the most for is his support of marriage equality, even though he's straight.
Even to, as far as gay rights, it's funny, well not funny, but how like Jacksonville now is like struggling with the issue of having adding protections for same-sex couples like Gainesville did. And you would think that being that they're a bigger metropolitan area, that it would not be such an issue. But just reading the newspaper and all that, how like you still have church leaders calling up the councilman and quoting Bible scriptures and saying that it's not right that you're forcing equal rights on people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still an issue that's going on here locally, and we're fortunate that we live here, like in Gainesville, that we have the protections on it too.
Yeah, and then one of the council people is a female African-American Baptist pastor. I think she's Baptist, and she's doing this sort of hate the sin, love the sinner garbage in public. It just doesn't follow. But anyway, you can write to those people in Jacksonville. I wrote to every single city council person, and then on behalf of the denomination sent out a letter to all of our clergy asking them to do that this week, and still have an influence. So let me bring this back so we can finish. So what do you think? I mean, how does this encourage you? Does it help you feel like you are less a target in the biblical world? What does going through a detailed lesson like this do for you, or how does it influence your thinking?
I think it was the best presentation I've ever heard, and I've heard multiple ones. Me too.
So does it influence your perceived standing as a follower of Jesus, or your perception of yourself as target?
I think if more people would actually study the root of the biblical sense like we did tonight, they'd have a better understanding of what Paul was talking about, and not just go around blatantly labeling us as, the ones that the Bible is against.
Okay. Anybody else?
Do you think those people are free thinkers enough to be able to do that?
No, I think
They've got to have it just
everyone
like
has been
this.
saying tonight, they've been spoon-fed everything that they or led to believe, and it might not necessarily be the right way.
Yeah. Picture me teaching this class at the, just pick one, First Baptist Church in Gainesville. I wouldn't have a job the next morning if I worked for them, I can tell you that. Even though it is accurate biblical interpretation.
Because it wouldn't fit what their heritage or what they want.
That's up to fundraising. All right, good. Well, let's look at, we've done a discussion. We don't need to know about my Kaspersky subscription. For next week, we're going to have a little bit of repeat as we get into the first chapter of Romans, but I'm going to really go through that very quickly. So we're going to do Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan's chapter on how to interpret or how to read a Pauline letter, and then we're going to jump into Romans head first. And so I'm going to try to, in the first part of Romans, since we've just covered basically the whole first chapter, to fast forward through that and make up a little time, because we're at this point we're about a week behind our schedule. And we may just add another week, which is not objectionable to me, but this will be a place where I don't want it to be just the same lesson all over again, which it will have a tendency to want to be. If you can read and you're willing to read, the more of Romans you can get read in the next week, the better. Take it at the best pace you can, and you don't have to, but if you want to be ready to explore it carefully, do that. And that's where we'll be. First the chapter in the book, and then the biblical interpretation. And I'll really be using a lot of, remember that first night when I laid out all those resources? I'll be using so many different ones to talk about that I can't really encourage one of them for you. So if I find something interesting, I'll mail you an article. Okay, so that's next week. And then we have, I think, one more week before our 4th of July break. So we'll stay continuous until July 4th, when we will have a 1 week break. All right. Anything else before the final slide? No? It's blue mushrooms, Jim, with little light sparkles on them, and little blue earth underneath, and it says good night. I wanted them to really flash, but I couldn't get them to do it. All right. Thank you very much. And, we can chat now, but